Everyone knows the story of the Vikings as savage raiders who appeared from nowhere, pillaged monasteries, and disappeared into the mist. But what if I told you that this Hollywood image is just the surface of something far more sinister and sophisticated? What if the Vikings weren't just random barbarians, but architects of the most brilliant conquest strategy Europe had ever seen? The truth about how Vikings conquered an entire continent will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval Europe. They didn't just raid and retreat. They didn't just steal gold and slaves. What they actually did was so methodical, so ruthless, and so effective that it changed the DNA of European civilization forever. Picture this. While European kings were playing chess with their armies, the Vikings were playing a completely different game. A game where every monastery burned, every coast terrorized, and every treaty signed was part of a master plan that would make them the puppet masters of Europe. And the most shocking part? Most of their victims never even realized they were being conquered until it was already too late. By the end of this story, you'll understand why modern historians are rewriting textbooks about the Viking Age. You'll learn about secret alliances that determined the fate of kingdoms, about psychological warfare that drove entire populations to madness, and about a conquest so complete that Viking blood still flows through the veins of European royalty today. If you're ready to discover the truth about history's most underestimated conquerors, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like me to expose. Because what you're about to learn about the Vikings will make you question everything else you've been told about the past. Now, let's start with what everyone thinks they know. The year is 793 AD, and the Vikings have just burst onto the European stage with their infamous attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in England. To most people, this marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period of random raids and piracy that would terrorize Europe for the next 3 centuries. The traditional story goes like this. Scandinavian warriors, driven by poverty and overpopulation in their homeland, began sailing across the seas in their longships to raid wealthy monasteries and coastal settlements. They were portrayed as pagan savages who worshipped violent gods, had no respect for Christian civilization, and were motivated purely by greed and bloodlust. European chroniclers of the time described them as divine punishment for the sins of Christendom. They seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with terrifying efficiency, and vanish before any organized response could be mounted. Their longships, with their shallow draft and ability to navigate both open seas and rivers, made them the perfect vessels for hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings appeared to have no grand strategy, no political ambitions beyond immediate plunder. They were seen as a natural disaster, like storms or plagues, something to be endured rather than understood. European kingdoms developed various defensive strategies, building coastal fortifications, organizing militias, paying tribute known as Danegeld to buy temporary peace. This narrative persisted for over 1,000 years. Even modern popular culture, from movies to video games, perpetuates the image of Vikings as chaotic berserkers who fought without discipline or long-term planning. They're portrayed as individualistic warriors who valued personal glory above all else, operating in loose confederations that could barely coordinate a single raid, let alone a continental conquest. But here's where the official story starts to crack. If Vikings were really just disorganized pirates, how do we explain what happened next? How do we account for the systematic nature of their expansion? How do we explain why their random raids always seem to target the most strategically important locations? And why, despite their supposed lack of political sophistication, did they end up controlling vast territories from Iceland to Russia? The truth is that what we've been told about Viking raids is like describing World War II by only talking about individual battles while completely ignoring the grand strategy behind them. The Vikings weren't random raiders, they were the advance guard of the most sophisticated conquest machine medieval Europe had ever faced. What historians are now discovering is that the Viking expansion wasn't chaotic at all. It was methodical, calculated, and executed with a level of strategic thinking that wouldn't be seen again until the age of Napoleon. Every raid, every settlement, every political alliance was part of a grand design that would reshape the map of Europe. The first clue lies in the timing and targets of Viking attacks. They didn't just randomly hit whatever monastery was closest. They systematically targeted the economic and political nerve centers of each kingdom they encountered. Monasteries weren't chosen for their religious significance, they were hit because they served as banks, administrative centers, and communication hubs for medieval kingdoms. When Vikings attacked Lindisfarne, they weren't just committing sacrilege, they were demonstrating to the entire Anglo-Saxon world that no institution, no matter how sacred or well defended, was beyond their reach. This psychological impact was worth more than all the gold they could carry. It was terrorism in the truest sense of the word, violence designed to create political change through fear. But the real genius of the Viking strategy becomes clear when you look at their intelligence network. These supposed barbarians possess detailed knowledge of European politics, trade routes, seasonal patterns, and military capabilities that would have been impressive even by modern standards. They knew when harvests would be collected, when armies would be away on campaign, when succession disputes would leave kingdoms vulnerable. How did raiders from Scandinavia acquire such precise intelligence? The answer lies in what historians now call the Viking Shadow Network, a web of merchants, slaves, mercenaries, and even Christian converts who fed information back to Scandinavian war chiefs years before any longship appeared on the horizon. Viking merchants had been trading throughout Europe for decades before the first raid. They established trading posts, married local women, and integrated themselves into the economic fabric of European society. When the time came for conquest, these merchants became the eyes and ears of the Viking war machine, providing real-time intelligence about everything from troop movements to political instability. The slave trade was another crucial component of this network. Vikings didn't just take slaves for manual labor, they specifically targeted individuals with valuable skills and knowledge. Captured monks could read and write, providing access to administrative documents. Kidnapped nobles could provide detailed information about court politics and military strategies. Foreign slaves brought back to Scandinavia served as permanent intelligence assets, constantly updating Viking chiefs about conditions in their homelands. Even more shocking was the Vikings' use of religious conversion as a weapon of war. Many Viking leaders would publicly convert to Christianity when it served their purposes, gaining access to European courts and churches, only to revert to paganism when it became convenient. This religious flexibility wasn't spiritual confusion, it was strategic deception on a continental scale. Consider the case of Rollo, the Viking leader who would eventually become the first Duke of Normandy. He converted to Christianity, married the daughter of the French king, and was granted vast territories in exchange for defending France against other Viking raiders. But historical evidence suggests that Rollo continued to worship Norse gods in private and maintained secret communications with pagan Viking leaders throughout his supposed Christian life. This pattern repeated itself across Europe. Viking leaders would convert to Christianity to gain legitimacy, then use their new positions to facilitate further Viking expansion. They became Trojan horses within European civilization, using Christian ceremonies to mask pagan conquest strategies. The psychological warfare employed by Vikings was equally sophisticated. They deliberately cultivated an image of supernatural ferocity, spreading stories about berserkers who felt no pain, warriors who could see the future, and longships that could sail through solid ground. These weren't just boasts, they were carefully constructed propaganda designed to demoralize enemies before battle even began. Viking raids were timed to coincide with important Christian holidays, maximizing the psychological impact on deeply religious populations. They would desecrate churches in specific ways designed to convince Christians that their God had abandoned them. They would leave certain survivors alive to spread terror, while killing others in ritualistic ways that would haunt the collective memory of entire regions. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Viking strategy was their use of what modern military theorists would call controlled chaos. They deliberately maintained the appearance of being disorganized raiders while secretly coordinating their activities across vast distances. Different Viking groups would attack simultaneously at multiple points, stretching defensive resources to the breaking point while appearing to be acting independently. This brings us to the story of one man whose life illuminates the true nature of Viking conquest like no other. His name was Ragnar Lothbrok, and while legends have turned him into a mythical figure, the historical Ragnar was something far more dangerous than any legend suggests. Ragnar wasn't just a warrior, he was a master strategist who understood that true conquest required more than military victory. It required the complete psychological and cultural transformation of the conquered. And his methods were so effective that they became the template for Viking expansion across the entire continent. Born sometime in the early 9th century, probably in Denmark, Ragnar came from a family that had already been involved in European politics for generations. His father wasn't a simple farmer, forced to raid by poverty. He was a sophisticated political leader who understood that Scandinavia's future lay not in isolation, but in the domination of European trade and politics. From his childhood, Ragnar was trained not just in warfare, but in languages, diplomacy, and what we would now call psychological operations. He could speak Old English, Frankish, and Latin fluently. He understood Christian theology well enough to debate with bishops. He knew European law, customs, and political systems better than many European nobles. When Ragnar began his career as a Viking leader, his first targets weren't chosen for their wealth, they were chosen for their strategic value. He attacked the same locations repeatedly, not because he was unimaginative, but because he was systematically destroying the administrative infrastructure of European kingdoms. Each raid was like a surgical strike designed to cripple specific aspects of enemy society. He would target monasteries that served as record-keeping centers, destroying tax rolls and legal documents that took decades to recreate. He would kidnap specific individuals whose knowledge was crucial to kingdom administration. He would destroy bridges, water mills, and other infrastructure that couldn't be quickly replaced. But Ragnar's true genius lay in his understanding of European politics. He realized that European kingdoms were held together by a complex web of personal relationships, religious authority, and economic interdependence. By disrupting these relationships, he could cause entire political systems to collapse from within. Ragnar began forming alliances with discontented European nobles, offering them Viking military support in exchange for political concessions. He backed succession disputes, funded rebellions, and even provided mercenary services to Christian kings against their enemies. Each intervention gave him greater insight into European weaknesses and more leverage over European politics. The most shocking aspect of Ragnar's strategy was his use of what historians now call conquest by integration. Rather than simply plundering European wealth and returning to Scandinavia, he began establishing permanent settlements that served as bases for further expansion. But these weren't traditional colonies, they were carefully designed hybrid communities that combined Viking military efficiency with European economic and political systems. Ragnar would conquer a territory, then invite European survivors to remain as partners in a new political arrangement. Vikings would provide military protection and access to Scandinavian trade networks, while Europeans would provide agricultural expertise, administrative skills, and connections to broader European markets. The result was a series of Viking-European hybrid societies that were more powerful than either culture could have created alone. These hybrid communities became incredibly attractive to Europeans, suffering under the inefficient and oppressive political systems of medieval kingdoms. Viking-controlled territories offered greater economic opportunities, more social mobility, and more personal freedom than traditional European feudal societies. As a result, Europeans began voluntarily migrating to Viking settlements, providing the workforce needed for further expansion. Ragnar's personal life reflected this strategic integration. He married multiple wives, some Viking, some European, creating family connections that spanned the continent. His children were raised to be cultural bridges, equally comfortable in Scandinavian halls and European courts. They became the next generation of Viking leaders, but with an even deeper understanding of European society than their father possessed. The marriage alliances Ragnar created weren't just personal, they were political weapons. When his daughter married a Frankish nobleman, she gained access to Frankish military plans. When his son became a mercenary for an English king, he learned about English defensive strategies. Each family connection became a source of intelligence and political influence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ragnar's career was his manipulation of European religious beliefs. He understood that Christianity was the ideological foundation of European political systems, and he systematically worked to undermine Christian authority while positioning himself as an alternative source of divine favor. Ragnar would time his victories to coincide with Christian holy days, suggesting to European populations that the Norse gods were more powerful than the Christian God. He would spare churches that submitted to him while destroying those that resisted, creating the impression that he enjoyed divine protection. He would even perform what appeared to be miracles, using advanced Scandinavian technology and psychological techniques to convince Europeans that he possessed supernatural powers. This religious manipulation was so effective that some European chroniclers began describing Ragnar in terms usually reserved for biblical figures. They wrote about his victories as if they were divine judgments, and his defeats as temporary setbacks in a cosmic struggle between good and evil. By the end of his career, Ragnar had become a legendary figure not just among Vikings, but among the very Europeans he was conquering. The climax of Ragnar's career and the ultimate revelation of Viking strategic sophistication came with what historians now call the Great Viking Convergence of 865 AD. What appeared to be separate Viking raids across England, France, and Ireland were actually coordinated elements of a single massive operation designed to bring down the entire structure of European political authority. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and execution. While Ragnar's sons led what appeared to be independent raids in different parts of Europe, they were actually implementing a carefully coordinated strategy designed to prevent European kingdoms from supporting each other. When the Great Heathen Army invaded England, simultaneous Viking attacks in France prevented French reinforcements from crossing the Channel. When Vikings threatened Irish monasteries, English resources that might have been used against the Great Army were diverted to protect Irish allies. But the most shocking aspect of this convergence was its ultimate goal. The Vikings weren't trying to destroy European civilization, they were trying to replace it. Every European institution they attacked, every political leader they killed, every economic system they disrupted was replaced with a Viking alternative that was more efficient, more profitable, and more attractive to ordinary Europeans. The Great Heathen Army didn't just conquer English kingdoms, it created a new form of government that combined Viking efficiency with English traditions. Viking leaders became English kings, but they ruled through a political system that incorporated the best elements of both cultures. English laws were rewritten to include Viking concepts of individual rights and economic freedom. English churches were rebuilt to incorporate Norse architectural and decorative elements. This cultural synthesis was so successful that within a generation, it became impossible to distinguish between Viking conquerors and English subjects. The two cultures had merged into something entirely new, a hybrid civilization that was stronger than either of its parent cultures. The same pattern played out across Europe. In France, Viking settlements in what would become Normandy created a new form of feudalism that combined Norse concepts of personal loyalty with Frankish traditions of land ownership. In Ireland, Viking trading posts grew into cities that became the economic centers of Irish civilization. In Russia, Viking warrior merchants established trade routes and political systems that would eventually grow into the Russian Empire. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this conquest was its invisibility. By the time European leaders realized what was happening, it was already too late. Vikings had become so integrated into European society that expelling them would have meant destroying European civilization itself. The true scope of Viking success only became clear in the aftermath of Ragnar's death. When he was finally captured and executed by King Aiel of Northumbria in 865 AD, his death triggered what appeared to be a massive Viking revenge campaign. But what actually happened was far more sophisticated than revenge. It was the final phase of a conquest strategy that had been decades in the making. Ragnar's sons launched coordinated attacks across Europe, but their goal wasn't destruction, it was consolidation. Every Viking victory brought European territories under a unified Scandinavian political system. Every European defeat removed an obstacle to Viking integration. By the time the dust settled, Vikings controlled or influenced virtually every major political decision made in Northern and Western Europe. The traditional historical narrative suggests that Viking power eventually declined as European kingdoms developed better defenses and Vikings converted to Christianity. But the reality is far different. Viking power didn't decline, it evolved into something less visible but more pervasive. The Vikings who settled in England became English nobles who retained their Scandinavian connections and political instincts. The Vikings who established Normandy became French dukes who would eventually conquer England and transform European military culture. The Vikings who created Russia became the ruling class of the largest European empire. Rather than disappearing, Vikings had become the secret aristocracy of European civilization. Even more shocking is the genetic evidence that modern scientists have uncovered. DNA analysis of European populations reveals that Viking expansion was far more extensive than historical records suggest. Significant Scandinavian genetic markers can be found in populations from Scotland to Sicily, from Ireland to Poland. The Vikings didn't just raid Europe, they literally changed the genetic composition of the European population. This genetic conquest was accomplished through a systematic program of intermarriage and settlement that was far more organized than historians previously understood. Vikings didn't just take European wives for personal reasons, they implemented a deliberate strategy of genetic integration designed to create a new European population that would be loyal to Scandinavian political values. The children of these Viking European unions became the bridge generation that completed the conquest. They inherited Scandinavian military and political skills, along with European cultural knowledge. They could move seamlessly between Viking and European societies, serving as ambassadors, spies, and political leaders for both sides simultaneously. By 1000 AD, the distinction between Viking and European had become meaningless. The conquest was so complete that Europeans themselves became Vikings, adopting Scandinavian political systems, economic practices, and cultural values. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 wasn't a foreign invasion, it was the final victory of Viking political culture over traditional European feudalism. But the most shocking revelation comes from recently discovered archaeological evidence suggesting that the Viking conquest was even more systematic than previously imagined. Excavations across Europe have uncovered identical Viking administrative buildings, suggesting that conquered territories were governed according to a standardized political system developed in Scandinavia. These buildings contained sophisticated record-keeping systems that tracked population movements, economic production, and political loyalty across vast distances. The Vikings weren't just conquering territories, they were creating a continental empire with standardized administrative procedures, unified economic policies, and coordinated military strategies. The evidence suggests that by 950 AD, this Viking empire stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from Ireland to the Black Sea. It was held together not by traditional imperial structures, but by a network of family relationships, economic partnerships, and cultural connections that were invisible to contemporary observers and have only recently been understood by modern historians. The impact of this hidden conquest extends far beyond medieval history. The political institutions, economic systems, and cultural values that we associate with modern European civilization were largely created by Vikings and their descendants. Parliamentary democracy, individual rights, free market capitalism, and even modern concepts of gender equality can all be traced back to Scandinavian political traditions that were spread across Europe through Viking conquest. The English Parliament, the French legal system, the German concept of individual liberty, all of these supposedly native European institutions were actually created by Viking descendants who retained their Scandinavian political instincts even after they had been culturally assimilated into European society. Even more remarkable is the discovery that Viking political influence extended far beyond Europe. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that Viking traders and explorers established permanent settlements in North America, Africa, and even Asia centuries before Columbus. These settlements served as bases for a global trading network that may have been the first truly international economic system in human history. The implications are staggering. The Vikings didn't just conquer Europe, they created the template for global civilization that we still follow today. The age of exploration, the rise of capitalism, the development of democratic institutions, all of these historical developments can be traced back to political and economic innovations first developed by Vikings and spread through their conquest of Europe. But perhaps the most shocking secret of all is that this conquest never really ended. The Viking approach to political expansion through economic integration, cultural assimilation, and strategic intermarriage became the standard method for imperial expansion used by European powers for the next 1,000 years. When Europeans conquered the Americas, they used Viking methods, establishing hybrid settlements, integrating local populations, creating new political systems that combined European and indigenous traditions. When European traders established themselves in Asia and Africa, they followed Viking precedents, building trading networks, forming strategic alliances, gradually extending political influence through economic relationships. The British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French colonial system, all of these were essentially Viking strategies applied on a global scale. The modern international system, with its complex web of economic relationships, cultural exchanges, and political alliances, is simply the Viking conquest of Europe extended to encompass the entire world. Today, as we face questions about globalization, immigration, and cultural integration, we're essentially dealing with the same challenges that Europeans faced during the Viking Age. The solutions that worked then, understanding that successful societies must be willing to adapt, integrate, and evolve, are still relevant today. The story of the Vikings isn't just ancient history, it's the blueprint for understanding how civilizations rise, expand, and transform themselves. And the most important lesson of all might be that the most successful conquests are those that leave both conquerors and conquered stronger than they were before. The archives of medieval monasteries still contain documents that haven't been fully translated or analyzed. Genetic research continues to reveal new details about population movements and cultural exchanges during the Viking Age. Archaeological excavations regularly uncover evidence of Viking influence in places where historians never expected to find it. What other secrets are hidden in the DNA of European populations? What other political innovations remain to be discovered in Scandinavian archaeological sites? What other aspects of modern civilization might turn out to have Viking origins that we've never suspected? The conquest of Europe by the Vikings wasn't just a historical event, it was the beginning of the modern world. And understanding how they accomplished something so massive, so systematic, and so invisible might be the key to understanding how our own world continues to change and evolve today. If this story has changed how you think about history and the forces that shape our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like me to investigate. Because the truth about the past is always more shocking, more complex, and more relevant than we ever imagined.